I think is important, and this is something really Joachim used, is like the authenticity, the real thing, something where you don't look through a window of a screen or you have some flat projection. There's something to that gives some poetry to that. It's an art form. I think art is an art form, and I still believe that there's potential for that in the entertainment world.
That is Alexander Bresinsky, and you're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 189 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. One of the things that I hoped to do when I started this podcast was to remind myself, as much as anyone, that there's more out there than just the Disney parks and Universal, and around the world, there are so many cool places that I hope to visit one day. And themed entertainment, the industry just keeps spreading and working in more interesting areas. And that makes me really excited about this week's guest, Alexander Bresinsky, who grew up in West Germany while the Berlin Wall was still up, got interested in laser show technology, started his first company in 1986, and then had some connections with Disney where he worked at DreamQuest Images while he was in school. And that company ultimately was bought by Disney and became the Secret Lab later, but he got to work on attractions like Batman for Warner Brothers Movie World, Star Quest Pavilion for Expo 93, so much other cool stuff, but ultimately ended up starting his own company in Germany, Flying Saucer, essentially helping to build the themed entertainment industry in that country, which has grown significantly since the 80s and 90s. And he's also been very involved in the Themed Entertainment Association as director of the European International Board, currently works at MKTengineering on the executive board, and tells what I think is a really interesting story where he would pivot into different areas, get really interested in a certain technology, and then change. And so what led to a diverse but also really cool career working in themed entertainment. I hope you enjoy this interview with Alexander. Let's do it. Here is Alexander Bresinsky. Alexander, thanks so much for talking with me on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great. I'm very interested in a lot of what you're doing and what you've done in the past, because I feel like you've had a really interesting career in certain areas of the themed entertainment industry that I don't talk about as much. So I think it's really good that we're able to talk. And I know you grew up in West Berlin, so I'm curious for you, how did you get interested even in like effects and illusions and entertainment and working in that field when you were just growing up?
That's a good question to start, actually. I never decided on purpose to get into that field. I mean, West Berlin back in the 70s had no theme park at all. We had no special attractions. I was particularly driven by passion and curiosity in a way. I remember taking toys apart, spending more time taking toys apart and figuring out how they work instead of playing with them, probably. And it all started back in high school, and I always found myself on the intersection of art and science, art and technology. So we had to take some electives back at high school, and I found myself I had chosen music and art on one side and physics and math on the other side. So I had this kind of interesting combination that pretty much tells what I'm interested in. I think it probably has been my physics teacher somehow that initiated that spark in a way. I was lucky to have a very funny and exciting physics teacher who was interested in telling stories besides the usual book and class book you had, and he implemented, or he added to the normal courses some work groups, working groups in the afternoon. And looking back to that, it's actually quite exciting because he decided to do like setting up little tiny lasers to do real holograms, something I wouldn't expect nowadays from high school. It was exciting. So we were doing holograms with tiny helium neon lasers, which were like shoebox size of large scale show lasers nowadays. But back then it was like the power of a laser pointer, but enough to do holograms, real 3D holograms, beam splitting and interferences on a high definition photographic plate. This was like one thing I remember that somehow got me a laser in my hands. And on the other hand, in the music course, I was really bad in singing. So we had we had the choir and we had to sing, and we were preparing that big presentation, that big show on, it was like a bombastic medieval composition. I'm not sure if you heard about Karl Orff and Carmina Burana. So it was like a 1930 piece composition, loud choir. And still, my teacher thought I'm not good in singing, and he asked me to do something else. And I didn't want to play an instrument. I remembered the lasers and some stuff I did when we were doing these holograms. I just took some whatever rippled glass and put it in the beam and got fascinated by what it did. And I said, okay, I'm using this to add something visual to the choir presentation. It was like our final year, and we had that presentation. So there was this laser, there were some really interesting experimental technical setups, and I had another course at the physics teacher, which was on 3D photography. So he was back at the time analog days slide film, so he was doing some 3D images, and we figured out how to do polarized projections. And so we had this final presentation in the last year of my high school where the choir was singing Carmina Burana, and I was experimenting with like tiny helium neon lasers. So this was like pretty much the foundation. I started. I never did this on intent. I never thought, okay, now I make the big money or big bucks. So I thought, okay, now I have to do something for a living probably. And I found this was quite interesting. So I bought like for several hundred Deutsche Mark at that time, helium neon laser. Back I was still living at the children's room in the apartment of my parents, and this was the start. Basically, I was taking every cheap technology that was somehow vibrating. You could mount a mirror to and do some scanning effect. So I took apart the electrical toothbrush of my parents, I guess, and we had an aquarium pump and everything that was capable of doing laser scanning with cheap technology. And this is pretty much the start. I remember some clients coming to the apartment of my parents, and I made the first money out of that. And this was back at that time Lichtwerk. And I got out of school. I had tiny company. A friend of mine became a partner, taking care of sound and light. And we were doing events, and probably we were like out of 3 companies in Germany that started with laser shows, one of 3 companies. Yeah, and this somehow was the start into that whatever entertainment industry with special technology. And there were a couple of things happening, and it was really great, exciting time. Probably the highlight back at the time was that I got hired to do the show for the Singapore National Day celebration. And I found myself in an airplane, and we had a company shipping all these lasers. These were lasers back at that time of like refrigerator-sized, water-cooled technology, amazing stuff, high voltage water and glass tubes. This somehow, while got me busy, and I didn't think about education in a way, and but somehow my parents told me you should, besides that, think about some proper education. And I still remember reading an article about a new course at the university, or it was actually a collaboration of the University of the Arts and the Polytechnical University, about a new course teaching entertainment technology and technical theater. So it was like beginning of the 90s. They figured out that all this show technology became more complex and proper education was missing for people being able to understand the technology, use the technology at one time, and on the other hand, listen to creative people, listen to a director or listen to people who wrote a story and figuring out how to implement that technology. So I did that. I was still having the tiny company, Lichtwerk, running at the same time. I had my partner who somehow backed me and said, yeah, go ahead, do that. And there was other thing I got interested in. Well, we all know Star Wars somehow influenced our careers one way or the other. Back at that time, to be honest, I thought theater is a bit boring. I'm really at a different point of view nowadays, but back at that time, I thought, wow, visual effects, that's interesting. I mean, I was like in Berlin, I had some interesting experiences with experimental art. There were some visual things. Brian Eno had amazing exhibitions in Berlin, and I had all these ideas about what I want to do, and laser had only been vector graphics. So if you think, still nowadays, beautiful laser shows, but it's still like vector graphics, and I got a little bit bored, and I got fascinated by stuff Industrial Light and Magic was doing back at the time. So I had all these books on visual effects. I was reading Cinefacts. And I thought, okay, how to do that? What should I do to get into that field? I now have this interesting education, but there was pretty much the guy heading that new course at these two universities. He was an American guy, and they got him to implement that new course, and we were supposed to do a practical semester, an internship at whatever company, usually at theaters. And I myself thought, okay, this could be my chance. And I'm not sure, probably wasn't naive, but I thought this would be exciting. And I just took the phone and I called ILM. I somehow made it through. I got someone at the desk and got a name. I mean, no emails back at that time anyway. And so I had a second call, and then I got a fax. Back at the time, no letter. It would have taken too long from the States to Germany. I got a fax telling me, no, sorry, we do not accept international interns. But, and I'm so thankful to that person, I forgot her name. He was human resources at ILM, and he said, we have another company. We have a good relationship to a company called DreamQuest Images. I have to be honest, I had not heard of them. I was focused to the big guys. DreamQuest back at that time was probably like the only big visual effects company back in the analog days that had large motion control gantry system. Amazing technology. They were all manufacturing that by themselves. Motion control, stepper motors, servo motors, running 30 meters, 90 feet gantry thing moving by the precision of the thousands of an inch in a way. They got the Academy Awards for Total Recall and The Abyss with Jim Cameron back at the time. Like probably the year before, they accepted me into the internship. I was like blown away. I still remember it was my birthday. I got that okay to do that internship. My partner at Lichtwerk said, oh, okay, do it. It sounds like an amazing chance. And I was supposed, I think it was supposed to be at least 6 months. It ended up to be almost a year. And then I returned the year after and the year after for a couple of months doing things. And this was like the next thing that got a spark. This was fascinating because they, due to the capabilities of their motion control system, they worked back at the time on ride films. I've been to Epcot Center, I think in 87 when I fell in love with Epcot Center, but I haven't seen Star Tours back at the time. Star Tours opened in 1987, I think. And I got there in 1991 and 2. And this was the year when DreamQuest was collaborating with ILM on the Back to the Future ride for Universal Studios. So they gave their gimbal, their motion control thing to ILM, and they were helping out each other. And DreamQuest was working on, I arrived there when they were finishing the Batman ride for Warner Brothers in Australia. Thinking, well, nowadays visual effects companies were totally different. Obviously, this was the analog days. They had a large model shop, amazing people doing handcrafted, detailed models, and this engineering machine shop building these motion control gantries. When I arrived, I was told I'm supposed to do my internship at the commercial division, which DreamQuest had like the feature division and the commercial division. So I was like first floor in between people organizing from their desk commercial shots and nothing really practical. And I was sneaking down on the stage level. They had like five huge stages, different sizes of motion control, different types. And I was like, wow, I would never have thought about that. This was like the first thing that really kept my attention. And the second thing was I have to say before that I sneaked down in the evenings or in the afternoons, but I wasn't allowed to do that. Interns weren't supposed to go downstairs, but I somehow made it to help out, setting up lights or helping like cleaning the floor. And they somehow appreciated that, and I more and more I got involved in that work, and I somehow made it to being a video assist and unloading cameras and stuff like that. So I got part of the crew, like working till 4 in the afternoon upstairs and then sneaking down. And due to the fact that Batman was in the final production stage, they worked late hours. And the second big thing, and I'm not sure how many people had that experience, was that we dailies, like when we checked the motion control stuff, we did dailies at a nearby industrial building where they set up, or another company set up a McFadden motion base. It's 6 degrees of freedom, hexapods, same technology Starters used, but even being to Starters, you never are able to see that big thing moving elegantly from the outside. And suddenly I, like from one excitement to the other, I got to that stage standing nearby this 30-seat theater, moving like a charm, moving lightweight, beautifully, and sitting inside was even more exciting. And this has been like the start of my internship, and I got really lucky because they were so successful because they could do with the motion control gantries, they could do long shots without cuts. So how they got the Academy Award for Total Recall was that long flight over the Martian surface and the abyss to all these submarines. And so Batman was one thing. This was a 35 millimeter VistaVision project. They got the second one I got part of had been for Landmark Entertainment back at the time. Landmark Entertainment, an amazing company. They were working on the pavilion for Samsung for the Korean Expo in '93. So this was like, okay, now you go from 35 to 70 mil. It was dome projection theater, a little bit like Back to the Future, right? And we was another setup, new motion base, other company programming motion base, and we did dailies with 70 mil film, but black and white, developed at DreamQuest Images, and color film as well. So I had to drive down to Burbank, get all these films, and I got part of that crew in a way, and I was really lucky and excited. And the third amazing thing had a connection to Germany. They reused the sets from StarQuest, from the Korean Expo Pavilion. They reused it for Asteroid Adventure at the German Phantasialand. Germany back at that time had small family-owned theme parks. But one of the biggest one, Europa Park certainly as well, but Phantasialand somehow made it possible to invest in this 48 frames, 70 mil projection theater with simulator technology called F Street Adventure. And I was still part of that crew. I think at that time I was allowed to even go during daytime supporting them, because this was still under development, and they were thinking about some real-time laser effects. I still remember calling German companies, figuring out how much an interactive laser system would be for that ride. And so it was like for the university, I had to write a big compilation of what I did, and like the final chapter was, okay, I did the calculation for interactive laser stuff for different visual, and they never made that happen because this was like out of budget and a little bit too vague, but it felt amazing. So what else? I mean, this is like sounds like paradise.
Can I ask you a question? You mentioned that you fell in love with Epcot Center, and I'm just curious, real quick. I think you went there, you said in 87. What was that like? I mean, why did that connect with you? Because that park at that time was just something. I mean, it's still incredible now, but for the time was just incredible. I mean, it's so different.
Yeah, definitely. It's different. I mean, the whole theme park world changed in a way in terms of pricing and the way you visit attractions. But back at that time, I mean, it's very vivid still. And I think I know a couple of people that went to Epcot the first time and fell in love. So there was something special about that. I remember the first ride I did was Spaceship Earth. And I had no idea what to expect out of that. I was going with a friend from Germany, and he was a little bit in the event business, so doing whatever evening events, and somehow know about show technology a little bit. But going to Spaceship Earth, we got out of that ride, and my knees were shaking. I was like catching my breath, and I was like, oh boy, this is amazing. I mean, thinking of that, and I mean, this was way before attractions became packed with displays and projection mapping. This was like the real thing. And even all the animatronics in there, all these additional technologies, whatever, smell, trickling of fire, and tiny little thing, forced perspective, transitions between scenes. And I still remember the fiber optics at the end. We later on, and this is something I probably we have time today to talk about as well. I met people of later than Spectra Entertainment, the people who really were taking care of these fiber optics and knew every tiny little fiber of that. I've never seen something like that. So, and in addition, whatever, World of Motion, Horizons, all this like first half, World Showcase is another story, an American Adventure. Back at that time, I couldn't appreciate the technology behind American Adventure. Thinking of it nowadays, and I know all these crazy stories or amazing stories about Epcot, like listening to Steve Alcorn or reading Steve Alcorn's book of this group of young people achieving something like that. It sounds like unbelievable. But from a visitor's perspective, I probably had been a good example of how this, what effect this had to people visiting. And this was so touching in a way, and touching not because of, well, probably because of some innovative technologies, but it was story-driven. There was some great rhythm to it. Spaceship Earth was like an amazing storytelling in a way. Yeah, so I mean, I could keep talking.
Yeah, I could too.
On and on. It's like
we'll circle back to what you're doing. I just had to mention because I went so young.
Just one additional thing. I had an amazing Epcot behind-the-scenes experience. Years later, I was like still being attached to that laser show family, worldwide family. There's an association called ILDA, ILDA, and they have the ILDA Awards, Laser Show Awards, and I actually don't remember the year exactly. A couple of years later, they invited me to become a judge on the ILDA Awards, and I got invited to go there. And I know that we were invited to go behind the scenes during the great show at the lagoon, and I was part of being in the boat, reloading fireworks. And do you remember that big ball in the middle of that lake? And this whole display, which obviously nowadays has a totally different technology and is LED driven. Back at that time, there were two of these large lasers inside, and they were scanning on a block of fiber optics, which was like probably like 1 foot 30 centimeters wide, and thousands of fibers. So they were scanning that, and this was then distributed each point of light to the outside with all these fibers, and I was inside that sphere on that lake, invited to see that technology. And I was like, wow, that's much more fascinating than the real show for me as being laser expert. And then we were standing on the rooftop on one of the buildings with the master control, checking that no airplanes were going above the lake, and all this behind the scenes stuff. So there was like this additional behind the scenes Epcot experience that even more made this park well known. And I'm quite curious seeing Epcot nowadays with all these interesting changes. Haven't been there yet. Looking forward to that. But for me personally, I mean, it all goes back even before when you're reading about the initial ideas about Epcot, which were different in a way Disney had. But there's such an interesting transition and technology and a new type of rides always or quite often were tested at Epcot. And I had, we waited for that because I had this kind of interesting experience. And later on, I figured out that WDI was checking something like that at Epcot. But we do this a little bit in a couple minutes, I guess.
We can circle back to kind of what you were doing next, too. I mean, I'm fascinated by a lot of what you mentioned about being inside that globe. I mean, because I've been by when they move it out into the lagoon, and it's like, much bigger than you think from far away. It's huge, but I want to make sure we get to talk about your career too. But I know circling back, you were at DreamQuest and worked on those projects. Kind of what were the next steps then when you either went back to Berlin or kind of what your career went from there?
Probably if I wouldn't have had to finish my study and had Lichtwerk, I would have desperately tried to get a green card. I checked out ways, and it was pretty hard back at that time there was that lottery, I think it still is. So I attended that lottery even a year later, but I never got a green card. So I got back excited about all the chances and the stuff I learned, and I sold Lichtwerk. I said, okay, it's time to go ahead. I cannot carry flight cases with later lasers and carrying water hoses for late night shows. And so I sold my shares of the company to my partner, and he does still exist, and he's still running it, and I'm very, very happy about that. But for me, it was time to move on. And I did actually two things with the money I got. I didn't save the money. I used it for two things. One thing was to buy and I actually have to step back. I bought a small silicon graphics rendering computer and bought a Softimage license. When I got back to DreamQuest the year after and the year after, they were transitioning to a digital visual effects company. I remember joining a meeting with Softimage, which had been like one of the 3D CGI companies, very early, amazing CGI companies. And DreamQuest purchased a couple licenses, and I was part of that meeting. We worked with Metrolight back at that time on digital effects for StarQuest. So I thought, okay, there is simulation, the physical stuff, hydraulics. There were no electrical actuators, and there's like 3D, the future. And I don't know how I split it up, but I bought that license. I bought the silicon graphics, and on the other hand, I took the rest of the money to buy some hydraulics. Wasn't enough money because you would have needed much more or complex and higher quality hydraulics. But I had a friend who was programming some hexapod stuff, and we had in like a basement, like all these really weird and wacky stuff, and we totally failed. I mean, I still remember coming up, and this was the interesting story. I now get back to WDI. We thought, okay, we cannot afford a big motion base like Batman, Star Tours, whatever, then Fantasyland later. So we thought we'd do a one-person flight simulator, and I had this idea and the concept of a magic carpet ride. So we had a little tiny model with Lego pneumatic hexapod stuff with a woven tiny puppet house carpet, and I think it was Captain Kirk figure lying on there to present that companies to try to get money. And it was actually a concept of a CRT projector, one of these old CRT projectors. There were no digital projectors, lying on that with a curved mirror, and we estimated this for a very low budget, and we never made it happen to do a real hydraulics presentation. This thing was shaky and vibrating, and we had all the oil and everything. At a certain point, I decided, okay, was kind of interesting, and this is something I learned from working in the States, or learned from the American way of doing business. In Germany, failing is a terrible thing, or you're taught failing is a terrible thing. And there was some positive business energy that said, okay, it might be a risk and you might fail, but you learned and you had fun. So we never made it. I know I visited Epcot Center a year later again, and there was this lab, WDI lab, with the Aladdin's Magic Carpet Ride. I'm not sure if you remember that?
I remember. I never rode it. I think it was at like the Innovations area or something. That,
right.
They had it in there.
It was like behind the scenes presentation with choosing people from the audience and having them a very heavy head-mounted display, putting on with some counterweight balance, and they were sitting like on a motorbike. It was kind of interesting. We failed with the hydraulic stuff, and there was like almost similar idea. I mean, they had the IP and they were really successful with providing an interesting experience. You could find it later on, I think, in one of the Disney Quest centers, another story of the Disney. But yeah, so I got back. I spent all my money on that, and I thought, okay, what should I do? I have to tell, to finish that story, I finished my study with a thesis that probably did another thing. It's quite interesting to think about my career, because I was really lucky meeting the right people at the right time. So I wrote the thesis on, I thought, working on simulators makes you think about the human senses. I learned from the guys programming the motion bases about like returning them to like zero position, where you have the whole range of motion again without your sense noticing that you were moving at a slow speed. So I learned about the vision you have and the frames per second and projecting. It was like back at the time when Doug Trumbull was doing tests with ShowScan, and he figured out that like 60 frames per second were even better. Back at the time, he was working on Back to the Future. So I thought, okay, I do a thesis with like two separate parts. One was about human senses and what human senses are important to do simulation in the entertainment industry, and the other half was about examples. And I used some examples of my study, of my time at DreamQuest. And no one, because we were so theater focused, no one at our school of the professors was willing to be the godfather of that thesis. So they were looking for someone, and we had that collaboration with the University of the Arts. And this was like, boom, this was like the start of probably one of the most important mentors I had in my career. There was I think he was the youngest professor at the university. He just started 1 year before, by the name of Joachim Sauter. And Joachim Sauter was, besides his career at the University of the Arts, was one of the founders of a company called Art+Com or Artcom. Really interesting group of people in Berlin. There were like coders, there were artists, visual artists, and probably him as the visionary and the head of new ways of implementing media, implementing technology. And they were very early researching on VR, and they were coding interesting things there. You might have heard about, and some might have seen the Netflix series, I think it's called $1 Billion Code. Art+Com back at the time was working on an attraction called TerraVision. They were developing this sphere, this whatever 1 meter diameter sphere 3 feet. You could move, and you could actually move the Earth in real time on the screen, and you got weather data and all stuff. And there's a long story behind that, and there were like the different opinions, but basically they through Silicon Graphics and some money they got part of the code of Google Earth, and there were some claims, and this is this Netflix series. But this tells a little bit the story where this company had been and what Joachim Beck at that time was as a visionary thinking of. And so they got me to meet him, and I was with my thesis back from Los Angeles, and we got excited about that. He was really taking part of that and enjoying reading my drafts, and this started a connection that lasted till last year. Unfortunately, he passed away last year. But he became a very important person in my life, but not just mentoring, but and this will be something we will be touching later. He was doing all this beautiful kinetic stuff and had some very interesting ideas that are like probably the foundation of my work today. So, well, back to that, did my thesis, had this amazing time with hydraulic oil, and had the Silicon Graphics, and we're doing 3D animations with an artist together in Berlin. And this was around, I think, 95, 96. And there was this new thing of interactivity. There was suddenly computers became multimedia was another term. So it was like CD-ROMs were suddenly on the market, and you could use large amounts of data to display on the screen, put some interactivity. And there were great examples of, I remember Peter Gabriel doing a CD-ROM and David Bowie doing a CD-ROM. And there was this company called Pixel Park. Pixel Park, another startup, you would call it today, that they were, I think, 10 people back at that time. And they were so successful that in the next couple of years, they were growing to 1,000, I think, with 3 offices or 4 offices over Germany. And I became part of their entertainment division. So I got a job I think I started as a project manager, but it was more than that. I loved to work creative way with the artists. We were doing some music CD-ROMs. The problem was this. I came from that large format, 48 frames per second IMAX thing, and ended up at Pixel Park. They were doing innovative things, but it was like tiny little flickering movies on the screen. And I thought, okay, no, I can't do that. It's like, okay, it's like a step back in terms of visual storytelling. It was interesting because there was like this non-linear work, non-linear storytelling, but I have to admit, I never got so attached to content or storytelling. I always got more fascinated by immersion in a way, and technologies that make you feel you're somewhere else. And I always appreciated other people thinking about the stories back at the time. So another thing I was lucky was that, like, after 2 years or 3 years, I think it was like almost 3 years at Pixel Park, I heard about a huge endeavor, a huge project that was supposed to happen nearby or at Studio Babelsberg in Potsdam. The wall was down by that time, and there were a lot of exciting things going on, even like this, cheesy would be not the right word, but like a tiny film theme park nearby Studio Babelsberg. And Studio Babelsberg had this, I'm not sure if you're aware of, this was this famous place where Metropolis, Fritz Lang's Metropolis, had been produced in the 1930s. Long history, amazing sound stages, but they were lacking of a digital visual effects facility. And I'm not sure about the States, but in Germany and in Europe, it seemed to be easy back at that time to acquire public funding money, and there were things or models of private public partnerships. So there were a couple of smart people and exciting people as well that were able to collect money from Bertelsmann, large content-driven company in Germany, and the German telecom and European Union money. So they somehow, I don't know how many millions it were, but they got a lot of money, and they were capable of developing this. I think it was supposed to be called Resolution Independent Digital Visual Effects Facility, and the short term was FX Center, and they couldn't find anyone in Germany running that, and they figured out to I don't know how they got him there. There was this amazing person, and he unfortunately passed away as well, by the name of Godfrey Pye. Godfrey Pye was one of the visual effects pioneers in the UK. He was running, I think, Russia's. Russia's was acquired by Richard Branson later on. So I think he was doing what he liked, and he somehow enjoyed getting to Germany and setting up that visual effects house. And I don't know how, someone called me at Pixel Park who heard about my career, weird career in a way, and said, hey, you should talk to that person. And I got to him, and he like immediately hired me out of Pixel Park, from the tiny stuff to this modern resolution independent visual effects house. And I was like, oh boy, okay, that's the future. It was like gold rush. We got all the quantums, and we like all these large scale silicon graphics. I think Artcom at the time and this visual effects house got all the silicon graphics, or most of them that were installed in Germany. I had no idea. It wasn't exciting setting this up. It had been as well exciting to join some of the feature film productions, but in the end, they failed by acquiring enough visual effects work. This was huge. I mean, this was like a four-story visual effects house, new build, fancy, futuristic building, and interesting architecture, and all the things, all the tools you needed in there to pretty much everything. We had a virtual studio back at the time, a little bit like what you have nowadays at whatever, like Mandalorian started with the XR LED screens. It's still blue screen technology, but motion tracking of the camera and virtual sets. So this was exciting, but in the end, the money wasn't there, or it wasn't enough money to keep this beast alive, and they decided to split this apart and make smaller companies be able to rent out parts of that. And another lucky incident, I got in touch with, VW, Volkswagen at that time. Volkswagen was doing some commercials, digital production at that facility. I got in touch with one of their head of productions, and she was aware, and this is another gold rush time, amazing time. Like at the turn of the century, at 2000, there were things moving pretty fast. Not in the theme park world, but more in the brand lands, commercial experiences, and probably one of the biggest had been the Autostadt in Wolfsburg. Wolfsburg, where most of the cars were manufactured back at the time, they invested lots of money in a brand land, in a theme park, pavilions, a little bit like an expo for car building stories. Very interesting concept. This reflected a little bit the approach of many companies, or the opinion of many companies, that entertainment couldn't be done in Germany. They hired companies like Jack Rouse back at the time, companies from the US, companies from the UK, to set up their pavilions. I couldn't remember of any German company. So she knew about me leaving the FX Center, and she asked me to join the group of people who were heading the VW Pavilion, which was supposed to be a dome projection thing, very interesting thing. And I was for a while joining them until, and this is another story, when you look at VW, there are different forces, and something is driven by fear in a way, and things can change pretty fast. And this group of people heading that VW, like the heart of this brand land, Autostadt, was was stopped working on that because someone was talking to a company in the UK and they fell in love with their concept. And so it was all taken apart and we got like lost our job from one day to the other. And this was one of the examples where even failure can be a great chance. Above my desk, I had graphics I bought at Disneyland, which was there had been this very early flying saucer attraction at Disneyland. And I think it was telling fly your own flying saucer. And I had this thing above my desk, and I thought, okay, what should I do? It was like from one week to the other, I lost my job, and it was a very well-paid job. I saved some money, and I thought, okay, there's no such company like WDI here in Germany. I did apply at Disneyland Paris back at the time. I think I heard back in a 3-line page saying, no, sorry, we don't have any job for you. And I wasn't that disappointed because I had this exciting idea of setting up something in Germany for permanent special technology exhibits. So this was like the birth of flying saucer attraction design and engineering. Yeah, and so I took this wonderful graphics artwork, Fly Your Own Flying Saucer. I thought it's an interesting working title. It stayed for 15 years, the title of the company, and I had an amazing partner from Pixel Park who joined me, who was taking care of all software issues, and I somehow took my enthusiasm for this world, and I had a couple of contacts from Autostadt and the other time in Los Angeles companies I was visiting and got to know. So we immediately started as somehow a extension to American companies. So I remember one of the first jobs, and this goes back to the story I told about the fiber optics, was with Spectra Entertainment, with Chris Brown's company, ex-MKTengineering crew of people who were supplying technology. And I think actually, I'm not sure about the concept, but they were doing a lot of work on the Sony Entertainment Music World in Berlin. It was an indoor experiential educational thing about music. They had a yellow submarine ride with the Beatles, a laser harp, stuff like that. It's a pretty spectacular fountain with fiber optics and laminar water. So there was laser stuff, there was mechanics, and they needed help. They were having a tough time. They couldn't afford all the flights. They needed some continuous support. So we immediately got a job like that. So working in a Spectra Entertainment, Sony Entertainment world, which was like working for an American attraction, basically. There was not that much German. Besides, we had to take care of the German TUV. There were some things wacky about that, and this was interesting. And on the other hand, I knew I was in touch with Bob Rogers and BRC, and VW had some problems with non-German companies at the Autostadt, so they made their experience, and that person I was in touch, she was still remembering me, and she said, "Okay, we have a new endeavor. We have this idea of a luxury car, and there's a special manufacturing site nearby Dresden, which is called the Gläserne Manufaktur, transparent factory. Really, really high-end, high-value facility, all glass. You could watch the procedure of setting up that, like the first luxury car for VW. And BRC was hired to do the visitor attractions around that. Very interesting, again, spherical, interactive projection things, some virtual production tour. And VW asked BRC, if you're going to do that, please hire Flying Saucer or work with Flying Saucer on that as a German partner. And immediately we had these like 2 projects, and this was really fun. It was a great crew. In Berlin, we were supporting all the logistics. We were even doing constant production on that. And this is how I met Bob Rogers. We even won the award, the Entertainment Association on that. We produced that film and was like being start for a company. And we thought about more jobs like that. And there wasn't that much going on in the following years with international companies. So like the initial international exciting start, which made me feel really happy about that. Changed to some, well, we had some other things for German companies, like the KUKA RoboCoaster was developed, and we were doing the initial designs. But besides that, it got more and more into a full service company. We were able of winning like a 4 million euro budget for doing a visitor center for a chemical company, BASF at the time. Big job, big budget, but not any more special ingenuity technology. So, and this pretty much had been the time when I was talking more and more to Joachim Sauter at Art+Com again. They changed their philosophy back at that time. It was like going from digital more to physical. They were doing spatial communication. They were doing concepts for attractions. And he proclaimed, okay, we should start the renaissance of the physical. And this pretty much was the time. And I'm not sure if you've ever seen that. There had been in 2007 that iconic attraction of 700 plus little spheres moving like magic in space. The first kinetic installation that really got many people goosebumps, and that had been copied over and over again in more an event type of presentation. But this permanent installation at BMW Museum nearby Munich was done by a company called MKT. A different MKT back in that time, but they were the only one who dared to come up with a kinetic mechanical installation. It was like 10 hours a day, but permanent installation. And this was developed by Joachim, and he somehow figured out how this poetry of motion and beauty of motion made a difference in terms of getting the attention of people or getting an emotional connection. And I remember visiting him and talking to him, and he showed me some behind the scenes footage. So I was like there from Flying Saucer doing some full concept stuff and somehow desperately looking for technical challenges. And there was this piece of 14 spheres floating in space. Was like the concept was about like voxels, three-dimensional pixels getting physical, telling the story about design and the design of cars. Again, most of the money in the German car industry made that possible. And I got more and more into the role, which I really loved, on the intersection of the engineers. That Art.com needed someone in between, talking to the engineers and the artists. So back to my initial education, and it was like a process over a couple of years that they decided to acquire Flying Saucer and merged and got a little bit like a speedboat for special attractions. But my heart and my fascination for that technology, and I remember getting into that machine shop at MKT. It was a different site back then. And I was like, oh boy, that's like, it feels like back at Dreamcrest, being at that gantry. And so to make that long story short, that's the company I'm working today for. And they have done many amazing attractions with focus on these like precision permanent installation stuff. Things like loads moving above people's heads at airports without any operator for years. And this is what I'm really doing right now, talking to artists that have ideas about what can we do that's physical in a way. There's still always digital technology for the laws of physics. Quite often I find myself like with our amazing team, I've been talking about feasibility and checking things and doing stuff like that. So like the ups and downs of my career, but I'm really, really lucky that always there was some kind of new thing, a new spark. And like today, being back at that international business, working for like a tiny company, and you're like about 20 people, but we have that boutique workshops and engineers that have such a diverse career coming from roller coaster design and aerospace, making things like that possible. And there's some special thing that even made companies. We just recently we lost that job, but we were, I think, the second on a installation on a skyscraper in New York, which required heavy knowledge about media technology, kinetic feeling for outdoor environments. And in the end, we unfortunately lost it. But I was like back in heaven in a way. And that's what I'm doing right now. So.
Well, you mentioned physical spaces and the importance of that. I feel like coming off of the the shutdown that had happened and everything. I mean, why do you think, given all these new technologies where like you and I can talk from across the world and everything, why is it so important though for people and like your interest in actually getting people into those physical spaces where you can kind of interact with really cool things?
A lot of things has to do with, well, actually two things. I mean, the most obvious is that after lockdown and somehow limitations to enjoying to screens, and even like my children who had to sit in front of the computer to do their school classes, people enjoying that obviously really very much to get out into the real world and enjoy things together with other people. But that's too easy. I mean, there are all these, especially in the themed entertainment industry, there are these like new influences, and VR became so popular for one reason or the other, and there's this metaverse thing. But I think it's important, and this is something really Joachim used, is like the authenticity, the real thing, something where you don't look through a window of a screen or you have some flat projection. There's something to that gives some poetry to that. It's an art form. I think art is an art form, and I still believe that there's potential for that in the entertainment world. Or I mean, look at what WDI does. What a really expensive animatronic at the Pandora attraction makes you feel. And they do know very well why they invest so much into these figures and into the real movement, three-dimensional stuff. And so, yeah, and I come back to perception and human senses. You can treat, but even 3D projection, or the reason why 3D movies really do not succeed, even if Jim Cameron thought about that, is that you're still cheating. You have stuff on your head. Same thing with VR. If you go to a place and enjoy the real thing, you concentrate on content. You concentrate on all the tiny little things that make this whole experience enjoyable.
I know you've been very involved too with the TEA, Theme Entertainment Association, for many years. And a big part of that is like trying to inspire kind of the next generation or, get them involved. So, I mean, if people are looking to get involved in the industry or kind of, I mean, what do you think are some of the, like, what advice would you give someone, or what kind of, from what you've learned, the approach or kind of how they should approach things?
Well, I do think if people are attracted or that industry is somehow there for life or want to do as a job, it's an easy way, because that industry, and this is what I felt and what I experienced, especially you mentioned TA, and I'll tell something about that in a minute. It's an industry of people that are really helpful in a way and interested in having the next generation being part of what they do. In my career, speaking of the Themed Entertainment Association, TA, really brings me to my first contact in that relation. That was a call from a guy called Nick Farmer of Farmer Attractions. And he was calling me and asked me if I would like to join the association. And this is just an example how easy you can get into that industry and how open people are and like embracing your interests, embracing your curiosity. And I've never experienced another industry that's helping position in terms of supporting next generation. I got member of IAPA, which is the other big association, which is quite interesting. But TEA is more on the people who do invent, who do conceptual part of that, to make things real on a whole, and not just invent popcorn machines. Or it's not about machines, but TEA is like for people who do not really know yet what they want to do. I mean, it's like these, if you look at WDI, and I think Marty Sklar, whom I met once, I'm not sure, but there's like 130 something disciplines at WDI. And this shows as an example what's needed in that industry. So first thing is you should be somehow inspired. You should be somehow being interested in that, and everything else. People, I mean, nowadays, for instance, it's a great thing to get in touch with people. So be curious, listen and learn and talk to people. It's really easy and it's fun. I'm a shy German. It took me a long way to really be open, and we have these TEA mixers, and in the beginning I was like, oh my God, I should do small talk to people I somehow admire, or I get starstruck, and I should talk to him or her. And I remember walking with Joe Rody at Disneyland Paris when we had a mixer there. And it was back at the time when he was working on Flying Mountains for Pandora. And he was talking to me in such a nice way and inspiring me that I was like, oh boy, in what other industry could you imagine something like that?
I have one kind of last big question, because I know you're working now. I mean, you're with MKT, and there's projects trying to go on. But like overall, in terms of the industry, like looking ahead, whether it's technology or just where things are going, like what is exciting you? Like what is something that you look at, like what you're doing, or even just the industry as a whole, that you think, wow, this is something that could be really cool and exciting going forward?
That's a question that's really not easy to answer. I mean, if you're dedicated and passionate about that industry, you constantly think about this. And there's one day where you think, okay, that's the new idea, and the other day you think that has been pretty stupid. There are two things that really constantly drive my thinking about that. One is related to a project we weren't able to carry out, weren't able to realize due to COVID. When I started setting up this new chapter with MKTengineering, and we moved into our new space, I met Chuck Fawcett, the president of the TA, or the past president of the TA, who was owning Animax Designs back at the time. Amazing company doing animatronics, and he was working with Adam Bizark on an interesting attraction for big theme park, and this was a big marionette, a big puppet, an animal that was ideal to do big puppeteering. Initially something, or originally something that works close, like at a close distance to people. But this was like just upscaling usual puppeteering, and they were approaching us with our knowledge about winches. And I thought, wow, this is ideal to do a kinetic that's not pure, beautiful art, that gets some magic approach. But this did not happen due to COVID, unfortunately. So this is like one thing where I think using the excitement about close, tiny approaches, it's like in magic, there are these magic tricks that only work at the table, and thinking about upscaling stuff, but giving it a different rhythm, giving it a different approach, and new terms of excitement, besides all these spectacular IP-driven rides and movies. One thing I'm thinking about in terms of the themed attraction industry, which I still would love to do a project like that. But let me tell you another thing. And getting older, you got fascinated by other fields, and we got a job awarded beginning of this year actually, and we're doing an installation at a large hospital in Switzerland. It's actually one of the biggest hospitals, or even the biggest in Switzerland. And we do an installation with a agency and creative people for a hospital. So it's nothing at an airport where people rush through, and you suddenly start thinking about what can you take from the power and the magic of other industry or the themed entertainment industry to put into a space like a hospital where you're not just visiting something for a couple of minutes. No, you probably are there when you're an employee all the time, every day. Or if you're a patient, you have your different story and problems. And what can you put in to somehow give whatever relaxation, tell stories, and use that power of what we appreciate in the surrounding of a theme park in different fields. I mean, there have been things in retail, there have been things in whatever, entertainment, dining, but this really excited me to talk to the creative people and tell them, think about that. You are doing a choreography, you're telling whatever visual story for a different audience. And this goes all back to how theater works and stuff like that. And it's a different audience than the theme park. So to summarize that, I think there are many other forms of entertainment that have not even touched yet in a way. And looking at all these price changes and larger things at theme parks, it's nice to look to other fields and think about what we learned or what I learned in other fields and do something new somewhere else, totally something different, but use these power of and this magic of what we know and the tools.
I think that's a great point, especially given what we've seen, even with, museums and science centers. But beyond that, places like hospitals, I think that's great. Well, Alexander, this has been great. I've really enjoyed learning so much about your career and everything you've done. So thanks so much for talking with me here on the podcast.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot, Dan.
If you like this episode, you should check out my interviews with other themed entertainment professionals like Adam B. Zark, Ryan Harmon, and many more. You can find those by going to tomorrowsociety.com/podcasts with an S at the end. If you'd like to help out the show, you can do so through Patreon and get access to some really cool perks. Go to patreon.com/tomorrowsociety to learn more. If you'd like to get a hold of me, send me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. Follow me on Twitter @tomorrowsoc, Facebook or Instagram @tomorrowsociety. Music for this podcast was written by Adam Hookie and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time we have the return of Tim Grassi of the Marty Called podcast, who will be back to talk about Epcot's transformation and a lot of recent news, including Universal announcing new parks. And some fun stuff from Disney too. Lots to cover. Can't wait to talk with Tim. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you again next time.